Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So the goal of this YouTube channel is to get people to think about stuff. The more people think, the more informed they're going to be, and the more informed you are, the more prepared you are. So in doing some research for a recent video I did about the downing of a US military drone by Iran, I was mulling over some theories of US military superiority around the world. Now, before I get into this, I want to make it abundantly clear that this is not an anti-American rant. If I say we in the context of this discussion, I'm referring to we as in Canada and the US being indiscernible allies who share the exact same geopolitical interests. So don't just read the title of the video and get all triggered. Just hear me out for what I have to say, because I assure you it comes from a place of concern. And many of you who watch this channel for a long time, you know I'm not a cheerleader for the military-industrial complex either. So this isn't a video that's saying, oh, we need to spend a bunch more money on the military. But if we want to understand what's truly going on in the world, you first have to have an open mind. And if we have a false sense of confidence or an arrogance about our military capabilities, then we are definitely bound for humiliation and defeat. For people who study military history and are familiar with all the various military hardware that's possessed by different countries, what I'm going to say today is probably nothing new to you. This is probably the line of thinking that you're always on. But as for myself, and I think the majority of people out there, we have this idea that the United States military is fiercely superior to almost every other military in the world. At least that's what we're told constantly. But after doing some research, I realized that I've been very naive about this whole thing. Just because country A spends $1 trillion on their military and country B spends $100 billion, it doesn't follow that country A is 10 times more superior. People presume that there's a one-to-one relationship with the amount of money spent and military capability, which is just not true. In the last video, I referenced the Millennium Challenge military exercise, which was conducted in 2002, in which a general of the military, I think he was 40 years, 3-star general, was able to defeat the American military. He was the one who was playing the role of the Iranians. He was able to defeat and inflict major damage on the American military using asymmetrical analog tactics against an army which was very linear and process-based in their thinking. So even if your military was 10 times more technologically superior, it doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be a cakewalk to defeat a more primitive fighting force. Asides money, it's tactics and strategy that is going to trump, no pun intended, military hardware. Now, before we dive in here, I have to reiterate this point. I am not a cheerleader for the military-industrial complex. My purview on these matters extends beyond simple-minded, jingoistic fanaticism. It's all about trying to figure out what's going on so we can be better prepared to deal with the consequences. And if you're walking around presuming that the US military is 10 times superior to every other military in the world, then you are going to be in for a rude awakening if we ever were to engage in a global conflict with a global superpower. Now, again, most people are probably aware of all this stuff, but for some reason, the realization has just hit me like a ton of bricks in the last 2 days, and I just have to talk about it. How much of that military budget is simple bloated bureaucracy? I think a lot of people forget, particularly and ironically conservatives, that the military is a government agency, just like the police, and that people want to keep their jobs. Just like government-funded healthcare workers, if people aren't getting sick, then you don't have a job. In the same way, if there are no conflicts to fight, there's less money spent on the military and people lose their jobs. So there is a vested interest for people to justify their budgets so that they can keep their jobs. And I'm not necessarily faulting people for this. I'm just saying that's the nature of the game when it comes to any government-funded enterprise. Now, if we look at this ballpark $1 trillion budget, I mean, if you factor everything in, like block budgets and all the other associated costs, we'll just call it $1 trillion because it's an easy number to work with. So the US has a presence in 150 countries around the world and about 165,000 soldiers abroad. Of this $1 trillion, about $100 billion is going to go to research, development, testing, and evaluation. Now, how much of that money, of that $100 billion, is actually being directly invested in the experimentation, which is going to move technologically forward? I'm guessing a very, very small percentage, because when you factor in the cost of maintaining buildings and all the people you have to employ to maintain these buildings, and all of the filler and wasted hours of a typical workday. So the amount of money which effectually materializes into some technological innovation is probably very small. And maybe 100 to 150 billions of dollars of that is spent on actual military hardware. But a lot of this money is just going to operation costs. So if you have a country like China or Russia whose budgets are not absorbed with trying to service these military bases around the world, yes, you have a smaller budget, but it's more centered and focused around defense. Now, these countries do have large military personnel costs to sustain. They have lots of people in their army. They have a lot of reservists. But if you look at the efficiency of a country like China, I mean, go and watch the 2018 Chinese military parade. I've harped on military parades before as a country just trying to appear stronger than it actually is. And it's mostly just a way to embolden the patriotic mindset in the country, when in reality it takes millions, if not $100 million to coordinate something like this. But more and more the Chinese are looking like a force to be reckoned with. This was the first military parade I've watched with China where I've sat back in my chair and I've said, what are these guys preparing for? Once China catches up to the US militarily, which is not far off, and you pair that with the coordination and the discipline of their soldiers, there is absolutely no doubt that they are going to be the most dominant superpower on the planet. China is already poised to overtake the United States as the world's top economy as early as next year. And to put it in perspective, India is expected to overtake the United States in 2030. So the writing is clearly on the wall. Now, the source of this kind of information should always be questionable, because there's going to be a lot of military industry trying to argue for why the government should be spending more money on the military. So part of this is just the usual racketeering of the military-industrial complex, but there is a realistic threat here that needs to be looked at. There's an article here that you should go and take a look at. It's called An Interactive Look at the U.S.-China Military Scorecard. And it shows you the advantages and disadvantages of each country in terms of their military capabilities over a period of time. And as you can see, in almost every dimension, the Chinese are improving and accelerating at a rapid rate. And we're perhaps only a decade off from China being at parity with US military capability. I should say most military technology, because clearly the American Navy is superior, and it's probably going to take any country decades in order to catch up to that. But a lot of people think that aircraft carriers are just giant floating targets which are obsolete nowadays, and they're only really good for engaging smaller countries with regionally bound militaries and limited strike capabilities. The one area where the US is going to reign supreme and dominate, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to be in terms of submarines and their anti-satellite and God knows whatever other types of offensive space technology that they have. However, in recent years, China has been making a lot of headway in this area. Ultimately, also, if the US gets caught up in a situation in Iran, that is going to leave Taiwan open for the Chinese. So the US has to be very selective with where they utilize their forces, because it's likely they're not going to be able to sustain a conflict on two fronts. It's not 1945 anymore. If the US were to ever engage in a conflict with a real opponent like Russia or China, not only would that be a never-ending conflict, because look how long Iraq dragged out, a battle between China and Russia, if it didn't go nuclear, would go on forever. And if you look at, in some cases, Chinese and Russians' superior defensive capabilities, those aircraft carriers are just going to be sitting ducks. I also came across some information which talked about how the US used to have surface-to-air missiles protecting their major cities, like most countries do around the world today. This is particularly important if you have a lot of coastal cities, which the US does, because of course they are far more susceptible to an all-out WW3 scenario. Whereas if you look at a lot of Russian targets, they're very far inland. So just geographically speaking, the US is far more vulnerable than its eastern counterparts, because those countries are in such close proximity to each other that they have to have a focus on defense, whereas over here we can just have our heads up in the clouds because there's no major threats next door, except of the intercontinental and submariner sort. So anyways, getting back to this, you can see the development here of the Chinese military. Yes, the Americans are still far superior along many of these dimensions, but the one thing that people forget about with regards to China is it's the hub of the world's manufacturing. So if they did have to kick it into high gear, if there ever was a larger scale conflict between superpowers, who's going to have the ability to engineer 1,000 tanks in a month? It's certainly not going to be the Americans. There's a video of a Chinese company who built a 57-story skyscraper in 19 days. In the place I live in, it literally takes them a year to build an overpass. And I know a lot of people will say, oh, it's just Chinese-made crap. And 10 years ago, you would probably be right. But the people in that country, they don't have the laissez-faire work ethic that we do over here. They have this very selfless, expendable mindset. And they quite frankly don't have the entitled mentality that we do, and that allows them to get this stuff done fast. They're simply mentally stronger, at least in these mechanical types of occupations, than our lackadaisical minds will permit. Now, I'm not trying to be some Eastern fanboy or anything like that. There's obviously a lot of drawbacks to the lifestyles that they lead. But a lot of people have this arrogant mindset that because we don't identify with a group as much and because we are more individual, at least that's what we tell ourselves, that we're going to somehow find a way to MacGyver our way through their thousands of mass-produced fifth-generation jet fighters. That is a delusion of the highest order. Now, the USA is expected to replace its whole fleet with F-35s, approximately 2,600 of these F-35s by the year 2037. We've seen what China can do in 20 years. The way things are going by that time, I wouldn't be surprised if China laps the US in their aviation technology. But, who am I to say I'm not an expert? Just looking at current trends, that's the way it's going. My objective here is not to fearmonger. I want people to be prepared. I want people to be informed. And if we're walking around with this arrogant sense that we're the best and we're the most superior military in the world and nobody can touch us, then all I can say is pride comes before the fall. And again, I'm not saying that we need to give trillions of dollars to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and all those other companies that benefit from the military-industrial complex. I'm just saying that if a conflict broke out in the world, we are far more vulnerable than a lot of people think. And the military generals, they know this. Look, no matter where you go in the world, absolute power is going to corrupt absolutely. There's going to be corruption under every single stone in every single government. There's going to be some measure of tyranny, no matter how democratic it is. As the saying goes, democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best one we have. But the reality is, and this is something that not a lot of people are going to hear, and it's going to get a lot of dislikes on this video. And like I say, I'm just trying to figure this stuff out for myself also. The reality is we live in a globalized world, and as such, there is going to be a power vacuum when you have that level of globalization. If it wasn't the United States in that position, somebody else is going to be in the position of policing the planet. Now, ideally, it wouldn't be that way. I agree. But unfortunately, we are not that evolved yet. And I could evoke the United Nations here and say that yes, we are evolving towards that end. But of course, a lot of people have some fairly intense opinions about the UN as well. So I guess you can never please anybody, and such is the nature of life. Because the US military is adapted for fighting smaller countries and overthrowing small regimes, it's not ready for a WW3 scenario. And you could probably argue the only reason why the US population hasn't been disarmed yet is because they know that's the only real defense they have against a WW3 scenario, because their military is not ready for it. Based on my research, the Eastern superpowers are more prepared for a global conflict scenario. The US's ICBMs, I could be wrong about this, and I don't want to be spreading any misinformation. Do your own research. But as far as I know, a lot of that stuff is pretty out of date compared to what these other countries have. Now, that said, we don't know everything that they have. You see a lot of these videos where they post all the statistics on what every country has, but the reality is no country is going to fully disclose all of the stuff that it has. So for all we know, there's a lot of secret weaponry out there that we don't know about, including in space. 10 years ago, they were talking about kinetic energy weapons, which were basically like simulated meteor strikes, launching very large projectiles from space at very high speeds, which would have the same effect as would a nuclear blast, minus all the radiation and the fallout. I don't know if that's something which is actually pursued or if it's just a concept, but we know that robotics, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, all of those things are things that are largely being worked on in the shadows. So there's going to be a lot of people who said, yeah, we knew all this already, and that's why we're preparing for that global SHTF scenario. And to you, my hat's off to you for not being as naive as I was. But I think there's a lot of people, myself included, who take American so-called military superiority for granted, and they do not realize that if a global conflict were to break out, the US would actually be at a very large disadvantage, because most of this military spending has been centered around how can we oust this little dictator and that little dictator and fight these little proxy wars all around the world. It's not about how we can defeat the Chinese or defeat Russia, at least not directly. Now, I'm not saying that high-ranking military personnel haven't considered this. Obviously, they have. Obviously, there are other clandestine operations that we don't know about, that I don't know about. But when you look on the surface of things, that's what you see. And it's likely that they're just praying for things to stay stable long enough so that they can begin working on those other aspects of the military, which would prepare them for a real fight with real competition. But even now, I have a greater appreciation for some of the proactive measures that the US has tried to take, because I think we want to believe that a lot of these countries are innocent, and indeed a lot of them are being antagonized and unfortunately are victims of the military-industrial complex, which is not to say that they're innocent. Every country and dictator is guilty of things which could be construed as inhumane and unjust and downright criminal. But there's a very fine line between respecting other nations' sovereignty and maintaining a relative peace in the world. I think a lot of these military generals would like the world to just be a place where you didn't have to take any proactive measures whatsoever, but they realize that the tendency for any country is to want to become an empire and to want to expand and to want to exact their influence over other populations. So basically, they believe in the dirty hands philosophy, that basically if we don't police the planet, somebody else will, and they're probably going to be worse than us. Once again, I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just trying to get in the mindset of how these people must be thinking about the global chessboard right now. But how about this? You help me out in the comments section. I'm not going to comment back or beak back in any of the comments. I'm going to read what you have to say. I'm going to give it a handshake. I'll give it a heart. If I don't agree with it, I'll give it a thumbs down. But I'll appreciate the fact that you wrote a comment. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Stay ready, and I'm going to say this again. I'm going to say this at the end of each and every video from here on in. Enjoy the time that you have with your family. It is limited. Life is short. Live your life, but stay ready. Thanks for watching Canadian Prepper. The best way to support this YouTube channel is to support yourself by gearing up through CanadianPreparedness.com or BugoutRoll.ca. Premium quality gear at the best possible price using the incredibly secure and easy to use Shopify platform. We offer free shipping to the United States for orders over $200 USD and free shipping to Canada over $75. So support the channel by supporting yourself.